All right, so everybody, thanks so much for listening. We do have Senator Tom Daschle. It's an honor and pleasure to have him on. He was the Senate Minority Leader back in 2004, and I remember that election because that was the first election I was mostly into with the Bush-Kerry election. And he will talk about that in just a second. Senator, like I said, it's an honor to have you on. Appreciate your time today.
Good to be with you, Rob. Thank you.
So, Senator, let's talk about this. You were in the Senate from 87 to 2005, quite a while. With that said, you've been with amazing senators and done many things in the Senate yourself. How has the Senate changed? It seems like it's such a slowdown right now.
Well, it's changed a lot, Rob. In most of the ways it's changed, I think, has not been for the good. I must say, over the last couple of weeks, I've been encouraged because there's been a number of good bipartisan pieces of legislation that have passed, and that's encouraging. So I think there's still opportunities for good work to be done, but I blame a lot of it on several things. First, the airplane. People leave on Thursdays and come back on Tuesdays. We try to run the country on Wednesdays, which I think is just absurd, but that's just the nature of politics these days. Nobody lives in Washington anymore. The money chase is incredible. It's a typical senator has to raise about $20,000 a day. Social media, of course, has really made the political environment pretty toxic. Truth is just an option. Cable news is also catalytic in creating the kind of confrontational environment that we've experienced. So all of those factors, I think, are consequential. Not to mention gerrymandering and how the base now is more important because the primary oftentimes means a lot more than the general election in most elections these days.
You know, I just want to go back to a time when you were in the Senate back in 2001. Obviously, 9/11 happened, attacks in New York, Pennsylvania, and also at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. Whether you liked President Bush or not, we came together as a country, supported the troops, supported the flag. President Trump, I felt like, had a time in coronavirus to do just that, to really wipe the floor. As a person that's a Democrat, I was scared of this, to wipe the floor with the Democrats and do a George W. Bush thing to get the country together. He did not do that, and he just lost the election. And then all the election claims of the stolen election, it really has got the country away from each other. And really, if it's either you're a Democrat, you're a Republican, and we can't come together and talk as a family. Can you talk about how that's changed even since 2001? And you saw this being in Washington, whether it's the Senate or outside of the Senate, and how this is really taken effect, and it's really crushing our country.
Well, there's no question that that leadership really has a lot to do with what circumstances we face. And you cited two striking examples that are in contrast. George Bush and I disagreed on a lot of things, but we did unite for that period of time after 9/11, in part because he was very determined to find ways to unite the country, and we worked together. Donald Trump has done just the opposite. And you're absolutely right. COVID in most other countries united the country. You saw leadership in Europe and in Asia united around ways to try to defeat COVID, or at least cope with it. Not a hard thing to do when everyone is affected by it. But Donald Trump didn't see it that way. And as you say, I mean, when you add to that the extraordinary misinformation around elections and campaigns, and the whole issue involving the 2020 election, and the deniers that are now part of the process. You've got deniers that just won elections in the primaries in 5 states just this week. So it's pretty frightening, actually, and Donald Trump has a lot of responsibility for it.
Senator Tom Daschle here on Fire Breathing Rob. Senator, going back to your election, the last one you ran, 2004, 4,508 votes to John Thune, who might be involved in a leadership position very soon. He is already in leadership, but he may be taking Mitch McConnell's place, I guess I should say, not too far down the road. With that said, can you talk about that race? That was a race that was very heated in 2004 in a presidential election year, and you were the Democrat in the Senate for the Democrats.
Well, South Dakota was trending red. It's been a purple state for a few decades. I mean, we elected George McGovern and Senator Jim Abourezk and Senator Tim Johnson and Congresswoman Stephanie Hertha Sandlin. And so we had an opportunity as Democrats to be competitive for a long time, but it began trending more and more Republican at the turn of the century. And George, as I said, George Bush and I worked together on things. We didn't work together on other things, especially on tax policy and ultimately around the war. And so South Dakotans were really, I think, torn by who you support. Was it George Bush or me? And I think on a very close call, as you note, the Republicans were able to win that race. I think the war was one issue. Abortion was a very big issue, as it continues to be in races cycle after cycle. But I think those issues in particular, when you are the leader, you take a higher profile. And in the past, South Dakotans, I think, were quite well known for voting for the person and not the party. But because I was the Democratic leader, I think party became much more of a factor in how people ultimately decided to vote. And so it was a little bit of an anomaly from what my past races were like.
Senator, you brought up abortion and obviously the war in Iraq. With that said, there was also, and I don't know if it was on the ballot in South Dakota, but I know it was on the ballot in Ohio. Obviously, that was the big state for Senator Kerry and also President Bush that were fighting for that. Gay marriage was really pushed in. The religious right was really rising up at that time in that election because of George W. Bush and Karl Rove. Do you feel like that issue affected your race also, even if it wasn't on the ballot?
I think it did. I was very supportive of gay marriage way back then, and as were many of my colleagues. And I think the social issues generally in rural states continue to get a lot of traction. They're different. We just saw the incredible vote in Kansas on abortion just this week. And so I have to say, I think that things may be changing, but back then, social issues were certainly something that I think a lot of voters considered as they made their choices.
So looking at the Senate, there are some good candidates on the Democratic side. I'm thinking of guys like Tim Ryan, congressman running for the U.S. Senate, John Fetterman, which was a race that, Pat Toomey had the seat. It looked like Fetterman probably would lose that race, but Oz is just in a world of his own, we'll just say. And it looks like Fetterman's going to win that race. Can the Democrats keep the Senate in 2022?
Well, I saw that 538 just projected that there's an 80% chance that Democrats will get somewhere between 47 and 53 votes. That just came out this week. I subscribe to that prediction at this point. That's exactly the opposite of what it was in May. In May, there was a similar prognostication, if you can make any prognostication that early, and the Republicans had about that kind of a chance. We're now fewer than 100 days before the election, and I think it's more trending towards the Democrats in both the House and Senate than it was just a month ago. So I'm a little more bullish about it, but it's going to be a slog.
Going back to your state of South Dakota, and I'm just going to push this in since we're talking about the Senate. This was an audience question from someone in Florida. They talk about West Virginia. Obviously, Joe Manchin is there, but, states like South Dakota, North Dakota, Missouri in general, those states, some of them used to be Democratic states. We even look at West Virginia before Al Gore ran for president. That was a Democratic state in presidential elections. Obviously, those went away. Missouri was tight in 2000, even in 2004. but those states have really went away from the Democrats. You're from one of these states in South Dakota. Do you see any Democrats on the rise that could win in some of these states that are really, really red, but maybe they can form their message to talk to working class Americans that really make up those states?
I do. If you learn anything from history, it's that there are cycles, and it used to be the Northeast was solid Republican.
Right.
You could guarantee a Republican was going to win in Maine or New Hampshire or Vermont. Now they're not quite solid Democratic, but they're much more Democratic than they've ever been. You remember the Solid South, of course, that was always a Democratic bastion. It's now a very strong Republican bastion. So I think these things go in cycles, sometimes takes decades, but I'm still confident that at some point, Democrats can be competitive in these rural states. They have to be. There's just too many outstanding issues. And I'm hopeful that once again, at some point in the future, Democrats can be as successful as we used to be in those days.
Is this an issue with the party, though, that they're not pushing candidates, the right candidates, I guess I should say, into these states? Or is this an issue with fundraising? Or, what is the issue right now, though?
Well, I still think the social issues have a lot to do with where voters are. And I think, for whatever reason, Donald Trump was pretty successful over the last couple of presidential cycles to attract a good deal of vote. There is, I think, a concern about the direction our country is taking, and people in rural America in particular feel abandoned, and many of them feel as if, ironically, the Republicans have a better message on that. I think we have to do a much better job of demonstrating to them our commitment to rural America in agriculture and in all the issues, healthcare and education and their economic circumstances. But we haven't done as good a job on that as we should have.
Are we pushing some of these issues too hard? The pronouns, the wokeness, all this stuff that we can't get these middle of the road Democrats that voted for Joe Biden, these suburban moms and dads?
Well, I think a lot of these issues just take a long time to become acceptable. Gay marriage is the best example. There was just it was dangerous to talk about gay marriage back in the 90s. And now I think it's like 70% of the American people support gay marriage. So some of these issues just take a while, and you've got to accept the consequences. I still believe that, regardless of how they may come down in a particular area, we have an obligation to do the right thing, to talk about the things that we believe in and care about. I think we've always got to be careful about the way we frame them. You can talk about many of these issues and frame them in a way that are not offensive or not woke. And I'm hoping that we can continue to do a better job of communicating our messages to the American people, especially in those areas where that continues to be perceived to be a real problem.
I want to go into two last questions on your time in the Senate before we just fire off some audience questions to end the interview. In 2009, you were under consideration by President Obama to be the Health and Human Services Secretary. With that said, obviously, you withdrew, but the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, in other words, was framed. If you were the HHS secretary, and obviously in talks with the president, the House, and the Senate in framing the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, would it have came out, I guess, the same way as the same bill? Would you have tinkered around it and made it different? What is your opinion on the Affordable Care Act as it states now, and how would you have changed it in that position?
Well, I spent a lot of time with the administration, the president during those times, and I give the president enormous credit.
Right.
Basically, what he wanted to do was to not make the perfect the enemy of the good. He contemplated various options and made the decision to begin with a bill that had previously enjoyed broad bipartisan support. Many Republicans supported a version of the Affordable Care Act back in the 90s. So he decided that that would be a good place to start in the hope that we could bring Republicans on board. Unfortunately, because of a lot of misinformation, that didn't happen. As hard as he tried and as long as he gave the Republicans to come on board, it became a toxic political issue. So I think he made the right decision, frankly. And over 30 million Americans have benefited as a result of the passage of this act, and they're now covered. We're now at the lowest point in terms of people not having health insurance. I think it's around 6% of the American people don't have health insurance today. And a big reason why is the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid expansion and the things that came with it. So yes, I was supportive at the time, and I'm still very proud as we look back at what the president was able to accomplish.
Two quick follow-ups, just to follow up on the Medicaid expansion. I'm from Rhode Island. They have Medicaid expansion up there, and obviously it's a Democratic state. You go down to Florida, where I live now, there's no Medicaid expansion. We had a person that ran for governor against Ron DeSantis, Andrew Gillum, that had his own personal issues, but he was fighting for Medicaid expansion. Now we have a primary. I'm voting for Charlie Crist, and he looks like he's going to win the primary as Congressman Crist. How do we get some of these states like Florida that, that maybe they have a Democratic governor, if Charlie Crist wins, which we hope he does, gets in there, but he's still fighting against a state Senate and a state House that is not going to push these Medicaid expansion to help these poor people among us that are all over the state of Florida, one of the most populous states in the country. Is there any way the federal government, the House or the Senate, can push some kind of bill to make sure that these states opt in and they can help the working folk of Florida, of America?
Well, you're absolutely right, Rob. It's just inexplicable. South Dakota is another example.
Yeah.
We've got Medicaid expansion on the ballot again in South Dakota this year, and we won it once, and we have to go back and do it again. But the federal government is covering 90% of the costs of expansion, 90%. And it's not only a health issue, it's a huge economic issue. It's a huge boon to every state who has expanded. We're talking about billions of dollars in additional economic growth and vitality as a result of the Medicaid expansion in those states where it's occurred. I take some solace, and it may be a little bit of a reach, but it took 17 years when Medicaid was initially enacted for all the states to join. But ultimately, every one of the states, Arizona was the last state, 17 years after Medicaid was initially authorized. So we have to be patient, but we have to be persistent. And I'm just hopeful that with persistence and over time, people will just see what a remarkable opportunity it is, not only for the people who are uninsured, but for the state in terms of the economic consequences that come with it.
Well, Senator, we just spoke about COVID-19 earlier on in this interview and how was a travesty of leadership from the president on down. With that said, a lot of people don't go to the hospital. A lot of people didn't go to the hospital at that time. A lot of people died because they didn't have health care, because they didn't have the Medicaid expansion. They were worried about hospital bills. So, in a way, I hate to say this, but a lot of these governors that are not signing on, they're killing their own citizens. It's unfortunate, but true.
It's true. There are people that have literally died because they have not had any health coverage, and it's just a tragedy. It's just tens of thousands of people over the years that simply couldn't afford to go to the hospital and didn't, and as a result gave their lives. And this shouldn't happen in this country.
No, not in the richest country in the world. Just moving on to these audience questions. I'm going to shoot these at you fairly quick, Senator. The Biden administration, you worked with President Biden. I'm sure you know a lot of people in the administration. 2 years in almost, what's your take on what's went on? I mean, I know he went into a tough, COVID spell coming in, but what is your take on the administration so far?
Well, I must say, I've known Joe for over 50 years now, and I look back, he inherited a very difficult time. Obviously, he has a 50-50 Senate, and he only has a 4-vote majority in the House. And yet he's been able to accomplish a good deal just in the last few weeks.
Right.
What he's been able to accomplish, I think, is really remarkable on guns and on NATO and on COVID and, on a whole array of things that it looks like we could get a good reconciliation bill with climate change and a number of other things that healthcare in this piece of legislation. So I just think that he doesn't get the credit he deserves. You're right. I've had the good fortune to work with a lot of people in his administration, and either before this or during the time that he's been in the White House. And I must say, I think Democrats ought to be more aggressively supportive and far more appreciative of the accomplishments that he's been able to demonstrate so far.
I call this the decade of the disease with COVID-19, monkeypox. There's a hepatitis outbreak there's issues with young kids now. Do you feel like that's one of the big reasons why the president doesn't get as much credit as he deserves? That because of this COVID crisis, now there's monkeypox, the hepatitis issue, as I said, the economy, the inflation. I mean, he was left with a mess by President Trump.
No question. And the inflation issue is worldwide. It's not just the United States. And we know why. We had real supply issues and greater demand and all of the things that came in the aftermath of COVID. And I say aftermath, we're not even through COVID yet. So I think that you're right. I think that he inherited just a whole slew of huge challenges, both internationally as well as domestically. And and as I said, if he had 60 or 70 votes in the Senate and House to be able to address his agenda, we'd been able to accomplish even more. But looking back, I think history is going to be very kind to Joe Biden.
Can we talk about you kind of talked about in the last answer on inflation and, speaking about the gas prices, which are coming down significantly in most states in the country. And a lot of people are thankful to the president for opening up those reserves and that helping a lot of people out. Inflation is still extremely high. I know you just alluded to this is happening all around the world. What can the president do besides the bill that was, pushed through with it hasn't been enacted yet, but it's been worked on by Schumer and also Joe Manchin. It looks like it'll pass. The only person it seems that's standing in the way of this passing is Kristen Sinema. Besides that bill, which is a great bill, as you stated, Senator, what can the Biden administration do to really clamp down that inflation and also other economic issues such as gas, food shortages in general?
Well, there is no silver bullet, as you know, Rob. It's very, very difficult. The Fed, of course, has a lot to do with longer term inflation reduction. I think the president, understandably, and I share his view on this, believes that too much concentration in most industries creates less competition. And so what he's attempting to do across the board is find ways to enhance more competition. And I believe that is a major factor in his toolbox as he attempts to find additional ways. But you've got to look at each one of the factors as it affects the economy. Gas prices, of course, that's a tough one because he's trying to make the transformation to more climate-friendly energy sources, and yet in the immediate term, what we need to do is make the availability of gasoline something that would help us in addressing the inflationary pressures that the industry has been facing now for the last year. So that dilemma, I think, is just one indication of how complex this really can be. But food is the same way. We have real high prices now with a lot of our food, and that also is a supply chain issue. And so we've got to figure out ways to enhance supplies and increase competition. And I think a lot of the things the president is attempting to do are focused on ways to address those challenges.
I was told that issue is really kicking into gear because there's not as many truck drivers as there were before. Also, a lot of people were retiring. The baby boomers are retiring, and there's not as many people being born right now in this country, whether it was before COVID or throughout COVID, with now. So that's a problem when we are not having as many workers. That goes into the immigration issue. I mean, we could go on for days upon days on this, Senator. And it seems like all these issues are really intertwined.
No question. They really are. And you mentioned immigration. That's another thing we need to do is to address immigration in a meaningful way. And I know how controversial and how confrontational the issue has been, but that's something we just can't ignore much longer.
Right. Let's kick it around with these last three questions, Senator. Ukraine and what's going on there. You were in the Senate for a while. You know all these issues back and forth, what happened with Russia and Ukraine. This is going on. A lot of people on the left, but even regular Democrats that aren't really progressive are kind of upset with the Ukraine issue. They stand with the people of Ukraine, but they're saying, we have tons of people that are going into poverty due to all these economic issues. And I agree with you, the president is working as hard as he can on these issues to try to help these working day Americans. But they're seeing all this money flooded to Ukraine, and they're saying there's people homeless on the streets and everybody is suffering in this country. What would you say back to those people that, don't agree with all this money going to Ukraine right now?
Well, when you look at how much is at stake, and I really think, Rob, people misunderstand just the consequences of failure in Ukraine. We ignore threats to democracy at our own peril. I don't think our democracy has ever been threatened more than what we've seen in the last few years, largely due to Donald Trump, but also due to the threats from authoritarian governments like Russia and China. So we've got to do what we can. I mean, the amount of money, we have a $4 trillion economy, and we're sending a few $billions to Ukraine. So it's such a small percentage of the federal budget. I think we've got to do both. You can't, it's absolutely essential that we address the many challenges we have here at home. And I think this president has attempted to do that. But we can't do it exclusively without recognizing that threats to democracy in Europe could be threats to democracy here in the United States in the not too distant future, if we're not willing to stand up and protect those democratic countries that are fighting hard for their own democracy today.
Senator, I'm extremely worried about these issues, and this leads into the next question. China, Russia, and you just stated these two countries, Saudi Arabia, they're working together on oil issues. They're trying to formulate another currency. This is a very scary time in our world where these powers that have, China has way more people than us, but besides the point, they're working together to undermine America, the leader of the free world. With that said, and now with China and Nancy Pelosi going to China, and I'm going to Taiwan, I'm sorry, excuse me. And I know you've worked with the speaker many times, I'm sure, throughout your time in Congress. With that said, President Biden was pushing the speaker not to go there. That was out in the news on CNN and many other, programs. What would you have told the speaker? Was it a good move to go there? And it was like kind of poking China in the eye. And now they're starting war games now over there in the South China Sea. It just, we're not in a good place as a country right now to, be fighting China, Russia, and all these other countries in between.
Well, I've been to Taiwan many, many times, and I must say I am very impressed by the people and by the remarkable democracy they've created. They're by far the most progressive democracy in all of Asia. Gay marriage is acceptable in Taiwan, which is unheard of in Asia. And they've created a democracy that is as transparent as any government anywhere in Asia today, or for that matter, in the rest of the world. I think they're in the top 10 with regard to the amount of trade that we have with Taiwan. So we have a lot of economic and democratic reasons to be supportive of Taiwan. And I was one who was very happy to applaud the speaker's trip to Taiwan. And I think it sends the right message that we're going to continue to be the advocates of democracy, even in spite of the challenges and the difficulties that sometimes that brings with it.
Okay. And then with the last two questions, again, Senator Tom Daschle here on Fire Breathing Rob. President Biden, whether he serves one term or two terms, he says that he's going to, go for re-election. Whether that happens, that's besides the point. What is the future in your mind for the Democratic Party? And also, can you name a few people that that viewers and listeners that are listening to this podcast should keep their eye on that are rising up in the Democratic Party ranks?
Well, I am bullish. I really think we've got a very exciting generational opportunity coming up with a number of good people, both in the Congress as well as in governorships. I would look at, governors in Kentucky and North Carolina and New Jersey and California, Minnesota. I mean, and Michigan, obviously. And so I think that's where part of our future leadership lies in these governorships. They've all done outstanding jobs. They've won consistently, and sometimes in red states, as we saw in Kentucky, especially. But also, North Carolina is, I guess you could still call it purple, but it's been a slog for Democrats to win in North Carolina. But so I think there's some real opportunities there, and I'm very excited about the future.
All right, Senator Tom Daschle, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate you coming on here.
Good to be with you, Rob. Thank you.